We are glad to welcome you to the Lucas History Channel. Please like and subscribe if you want to see more stories like this. Enjoy your viewing. The Plumber. I've always thought of our home as a sanctuary, a place where the outside world couldn't reach us. It's funny how quickly that sense of safety can vanish, as if it was never there at all. The day started like any other. I woke early, the morning sun streaming through the half-drawn curtains, painting our bedroom in hues of gold. Beth was already up. I could hear the faint clink of dishes in the kitchen and smell coffee brewing. It was routine. Comforting. Until it wasn't. It began with a knock at the door, a sharp, purposeful rap that echoed through the house. I had no reason to pay it much mind. After all, life was filled with mundane visitors, deliverymen, salesmen, the occasional neighbor borrowing sugar. But something in that knock, or maybe the way Beth hesitated before answering it, struck me as odd. From the hallway, I could see her silhouette at the door, framed by morning light. The man on the other side was burly, in a way that seemed deliberate, biceps straining against a faded work shirt, a tool belt slung low over his hips. He introduced himself as Dan, the plumber, with a voice rough and deep. Beth smiled, a warm, lingering smile I hadn't seen in years. I should have gone back to my coffee and let them handle whatever plumbing issue had cropped up. But I didn't. I lingered. Watched. She ushered him inside with an ease that unsettled me. They spoke in low tones I couldn't quite catch, their heads bent close together. It was just business, I told myself. But doubt had already begun to creep in, quiet and insidious. I retreated to my office, determined not to give in to the irrational thoughts swirling in my head. Work would distract me. But minutes dragged into hours, and every sound from the kitchen, the muffled laughter, the occasional thud, pulled me further from the spreadsheets on my screen. By the time I convinced myself to investigate, the laughter had stopped, replaced by an unnerving silence. I found them in the laundry room. Dan was crouched beside the sink, tools scattered around him. Beth stood above him, arms crossed, her posture relaxed but her gaze intent. Too intent. She said something, a joke, perhaps, and he looked up at her with a grin that made my stomach churn. Problem with the pipes? I asked, leaning against the doorframe. My voice was calm, even casual, though I felt anything but. Beth jumped slightly, as if she hadn't heard me approach. Oh, Mark. Yes, the kitchen sink's been acting up, and I thought it was time to finally get it looked at. Dan's been great, he really knows his stuff. Dan glanced up at me, his expression unreadable. Just about done here, he said, his tone clipped. Beth nodded, her cheeks flushing. I told myself it was nothing, just the awkwardness of being caught mid-repair. But as I watched her fuss with a strand of hair, her fingers fidgeting in a way I hadn't seen since our college days, I knew there was more to it. I just didn't know what. Dan left shortly after, his truck rumbling away down the street. Beth returned to the kitchen, humming softly to herself. She was in an uncharacteristically good mood, smiling as she prepared lunch. I didn't know whether to feel relieved or more suspicious. By the time evening rolled around, I had convinced myself that I was imagining things. It was just a plumber. Just a repair. Nothing more. But as I lay in bed that night, the memory of Beth's smile lingered, haunting me in the quiet darkness. Beth had always been good at masking her emotions. In the early years of our marriage, it was a skill I admired, her ability to stay calm under pressure, to navigate life's hurdles with grace. Now, it felt like a barrier, something impenetrable that kept me from understanding what was happening inside her mind. The morning after Dan's visit, I decided to let it go. Or at least, I told myself I would. Trust was a cornerstone of our marriage, and I wasn't going to let a passing moment of doubt unravel a decade of life together. I kissed her on the cheek as I left for work, and she returned it absent-mindedly, already scrolling through her phone. But as the hours passed, my unease grew. It was irrational, I knew. Beth had given me no real reason to suspect her of anything, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. By lunchtime, the nagging thoughts had become unbearable. On a whim, I called home. The phone rang several times before she answered. "Hey, Mark," she said, her voice bright and cheerful. "What are you up to?" I asked, feigning casualness. "Oh, nothing much. Just cleaning up around the house." "Why?" I hesitated. "No reason. Just wanted to check in." She laughed softly. "You're sweet. I'll see you tonight, okay? Love you." "Love you too," I replied, though the words felt hollow. The conversation should have reassured me, but it didn't. Her cheerfulness felt rehearsed, like a line delivered in a play. By the time I returned home that evening, I was on edge, every detail of the house scrutinized for signs of something. Anything. Beth greeted me with a kiss and a plate of lasagna. She chatted animatedly about her day, telling me about a new recipe she wanted to try, a movie she thought we'd enjoy. She was her usual self, or at least, the version of her I had grown accustomed to. But something about her seemed different. Lighter. As if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. It wasn't until a few days later that the truth began to reveal itself. I came home early that Friday, hoping to surprise her with dinner reservations at her favorite restaurant. As I stepped through the front door, the sound of voices drifted from the kitchen. Beth's laughter echoed down the hall, followed by a deep, familiar chuckle. "Dan." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, I considered walking away, pretending I hadn't heard anything, convincing myself that it was nothing. But the thought of leaving without knowing gnawed at me, and so I moved closer, my footsteps silent against the hardwood floor. Peeking around the corner, I saw them standing by the sink. Beth was leaning against the counter, her arms crossed in a way that accentuated the curve of her figure. Dan stood close, too close, his hands resting on the counter on either side of her, as though trapping her in place. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but the look in their eyes told me everything I needed to know. It was the kind of look we used to share, the kind that spoke of longing, of secrets whispered in the dark. My mind raced, a storm of anger, betrayal, and disbelief swirling inside me. How long had this been going on? Was it just a flirtation, or had they already crossed the line? Part of me wanted to burst into the room, to demand answers, to make them see the pain they were causing. But another part of me, a quieter, more insidious part, wanted to wait. To gather evidence. To be absolutely certain before I confronted her. I backed away, my chest tight with the weight of my discovery. Upstairs, I locked myself in the bathroom and stared at my reflection in the mirror. The man looking back at me was a stranger, his face pale, his eyes hollow. I had always considered myself a good husband. I worked hard, provided for my family, and did my best to show Beth how much I loved her. So why wasn't it enough? That night, I didn't say a word about what I had seen. Beth was as cheerful as ever, chatting about her plans for the weekend and asking if I wanted to take the kids to the park on Sunday. I nodded along, my responses automatic, my mind elsewhere. Lying in bed beside her, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them together, their laughter, their closeness, the spark that should have been reserved for us. And in the silence of the night, a single, unrelenting thought took root in my mind. I had to know the truth. The weekend passed in a haze. I went through the motions, smiling for the kids, making small talk with Beth, pretending that everything was normal. But beneath the surface, I was unraveling, my thoughts consumed by questions I didn't want to answer. Monday came, and with it, an opportunity. Beth had mentioned she was taking the kids to a playdate at her friend Amy's house. She'd be gone for most of the afternoon, giving me the time I needed. As soon as she left, I began searching the house for anything that might confirm my suspicions. Her phone was the obvious place to start, but Beth rarely left it unattended. I knew her passcode, though, one of the few remnants of trust between us. Unlocking it felt like crossing a line I couldn't uncross, but the need to know outweighed my guilt. At first, I found nothing. Her messages were ordinary, filled with exchanges about school pickups, grocery lists, and weekend plans. But then I noticed a name that made my blood run cold: Dan. It was buried in a thread under the innocuous title, Plumbing Issues. I opened the conversation, my hands trembling. The messages began innocently enough, scheduling repairs, discussing costs, thanking him for his help. But as I scrolled further, the tone shifted. The exchanges became more personal, more intimate. Beth joked about her bad cooking, and Dan replied with teasing remarks about how he'd gladly take the risk for her company. She sent him a photo of a cake she'd baked, and his response was a flurry of compliments. Then there were the messages from the week before, the ones I had feared most. Beth, thank you for today. It felt so good to talk to someone who really listens. Dan, anytime, Beth. You deserve to be heard. And seen. Beth, Mark doesn't notice me anymore. Not the way you do. Dan, his loss. Beth, would it be crazy to say I've been thinking about you? Dan, not crazy at all. I've been thinking about you too. I stopped reading, unable to stomach the rest. My hand clenched around the phone, my knuckles turning white. This wasn't just a harmless flirtation. It was a betrayal, plain and simple. When Beth returned home later that afternoon, I was waiting for her. She seemed surprised to see me in the living room, my expression grim. Mark? Is everything okay? She asked, setting her purse down. I held up her phone. Want to explain this? Her eyes widened, her face draining of color. You went through my phone. Don't turn this on me, Beth. Just tell me the truth. What's going on between you and Dan? She hesitated, her gaze darting to the floor. It's not what you think. Then what is it? I demanded, my voice rising. Because from where I'm standing, it looks a hell of a lot like you're having an affair. It's not an affair, she said quickly. We've only been talking. That's all. Talking? I scoffed, throwing the phone onto the coffee table. You think I'm stupid? I saw the messages, Beth. You've been confiding in him, sharing things you should be sharing with me. You told him I don't notice you. You've been thinking about him. Do you even hear yourself? Tears welled in her eyes, but I felt no sympathy. Mark, Why, Beth? I interrupted, my voice cracking. Why him? Why anyone? She took a deep breath, her tears spilling over. I don't know, she admitted. I guess. I felt invisible. After all these years, after the kids, I needed to feel wanted again. I stared at her, my heart breaking all over again. I wanted you, Beth. I always have. But you didn't come to me. You went to him. I didn't mean for it to happen, she said softly. It just did. I shook my head, the weight of her words settling over me like a shroud. I don't know if I can forgive this, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Beth stepped closer, reaching for my hand. Please, Mark. I'll end it. I'll never speak to him again. Just, give me another chance. For us. For the kids. I pulled away, unable to meet her gaze. I need time to think. And with that, I left the house, the sound of her sobs echoing behind me. I drove aimlessly, the familiar streets of our neighborhood blurring into a haze. My mind raced with a cacophony of thoughts, none of them offering clarity or peace. I had always imagined betrayal as a clean break, an obvious line you could point to and say, this is where it all fell apart. But the reality was messy, tangled in a web of emotions I hadn't been prepared to face. Beth's words echoed in my head, I needed to feel wanted again. How had I failed her so completely that she sought validation from another man? I couldn't escape the gnawing feeling that this was somehow my fault, that I hadn't done enough, been enough. But no. That wasn't fair. I had given her everything I could, love, stability, a family. And she had thrown it away for what? A fleeting thrill? A man who fixed leaky faucets and flirted with other men's wives. I pulled into the parking lot of a quiet diner, its neon sign flickering in the evening light. The smell of fried food and stale coffee hit me as I stepped inside. I found a booth in the corner, away from the sparse crowd, and ordered a coffee I didn't plan to drink. The minutes ticked by as I stared out the window, the mug growing cold in my hands. My mind drifted back to our early days, long nights spent talking about our dreams, the way Beth's laughter used to light up a room. Those memories felt like they belonged to another lifetime, a happier version of us I couldn't seem to reconcile with the present. My phone buzzed, snapping me out of my thoughts. It was a text from Beth. "Mark, please come home. I'm so sorry. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this. I love you." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to go back to the way things were before Dan, before the lies, before I realized just how fragile our marriage had become. But could I? I set the phone down and buried my face in my hands. The truth was, I didn't know if I could ever trust her again. Even if she ended things with Dan, even if she begged for forgiveness, the damage had been done. How do you rebuild a foundation that's already crumbled? Refill? The waitress's voice startled me. She was older, her kind eyes heavy with the weight of someone who'd seen her share of life's hardships. I nodded, and she poured another cup of coffee, lingering for a moment. "Tough night?" she asked gently. I hesitated before nodding. "You could say that. Sometimes, it helps to talk," she said, her voice warm but not intrusive. "Even if it's just to a stranger." I offered a faint smile. "Thanks, but I think I just need to figure this out on my own." She nodded and left me to my thoughts, but her words lingered. Maybe she was right. Maybe talking to someone, anyone, would help me make sense of the chaos in my head. I thought about my parents, about how they had weathered their share of storms in their 40 years together. I thought about calling my dad, seeking his advice, but the idea of admitting what had happened felt like an insurmountable hurdle. Instead, I sat there, alone with my thoughts, as the sky outside faded into night. By the time I left the diner, I still hadn't made a decision. The house was dark when I returned, the kids already asleep. Beth was waiting for me in the living room, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She looked up as I entered, her expression a mixture of hope and fear. "I didn't think you'd come back," she said softly. I stood in the doorway, unsure of what to say. "I needed some time." "And?" she prompted, her voice trembling. "And I don't know," I admitted. "I don't know if I can move past this, Beth. I don't know if I want to." Her face crumpled, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "Mark, please. I made a mistake, a terrible, stupid mistake. But I love you. I love our family. I can't lose you." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to forgive her. But the pain was too raw, the wound too fresh. "I need more time," I said finally, my voice heavy with resignation. "I can't make any promises right now." Beth nodded, her shoulders sagging in defeat. "Take all the time you need. Just, please don't give up on us." I didn't respond. Instead, I turned and headed upstairs, leaving her alone with her grief. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I realized that no matter what decision I made, nothing would ever be the same again. The days that followed felt like walking through a fog. Beth gave me space, her presence subdued as she tiptoed around the house. She spent more time with the kids, her laughter forced and brittle, as if trying to stitch together the pieces of our broken family with sheer willpower. I stayed late at work, avoiding home as much as I could. Nights were the worst. The silence between us, once comfortable, was now suffocating. I couldn't look at her without hearing Dan's voice, imagining the intimacy they'd shared. It consumed me. One evening, as I sat in the darkened living room, nursing a glass of whiskey, my phone buzzed. A text from an unfamiliar number appeared on the screen. "Mark, it's Dan. Can we talk?" My blood ran cold. I stared at the message, my pulse pounding in my ears. What could he possibly want? What more could he have to say after he'd already taken so much from me? I considered ignoring it, but curiosity, or maybe anger, got the better of me. I dialed the number, my hands trembling. He picked up after the first ring. "Mark," he said, his voice steady but cautious. "Thanks for calling. What do you want?" I snapped, my words clipped. "I wanted to apologize," he began. "I never meant to cause trouble between you and Beth." "Trouble?" I spat. "You call destroying my marriage trouble?" There was a pause on the other end, and when he spoke again, his tone was softer. "I didn't mean for things to go this far. Beth, she seemed lonely. She talked about how distant you'd been, how she felt invisible." I gripped the phone tighter, my jaw clenched. "Don't you dare try to justify what you did. You had no right." "You're absolutely right," he said quickly. "I was wrong, and I take full responsibility. But you need to know, it wasn't just about me. Beth is struggling, Mark. She's hurting." His words hung in the air, twisting the knife already lodged in my chest. I didn't want to hear it, didn't want to acknowledge that there might be a deeper truth beneath her betrayal. "I'm done talking to you," I said, my voice cold. "Stay away from my wife. Stay away from my family." I ended the call and threw the phone onto the couch, my hands shaking. His words echoed in my mind, "Beth is struggling." It didn't excuse her actions, but it planted a seed of doubt. Had I been so focused on work, on providing for our family, that I'd missed the signs? Had I been blind to her pain? The next morning, I decided to confront her. She was in the kitchen, packing lunches for the kids, her movements deliberate and tense. When she saw me, she straightened, her expression guarded. "Mark," she began, but I held up a hand to stop her. "I spoke to Dan," I said, watching her reaction closely. Her eyes widened, a flicker of fear crossing her face. "What did he say?" she asked quietly. "That you're hurting," I replied. "That you've been feeling invisible. Is that true?" She hesitated, her hands trembling as she set down the knife she'd been using. I didn't know how to tell you. You're such a good husband, Mark. You work so hard for us, for the kids. But somewhere along the way, I felt like I stopped being your wife and became someone in the background. A mother. A caretaker. Not your partner." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, that I'd always loved her, always noticed her. But deep down, I knew there was some truth to what she was saying. Life had a way of dulling the edges of a relationship, of turning passion into routine. "You should have talked to me," I said finally, my voice trembling. "You should have come to me, Beth. Not him." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I know I messed up. I betrayed you, Mark, and I'll never forgive myself for that. But I don't want to lose you. Please, tell me how to fix this." I looked at her, my heart torn between love and anger, between the memories of who we were and the reality of what we'd become. "I don't know if we can fix this," I admitted. "But for the sake of the kids, we'll try." Her sobs deepened, but she nodded, clinging to the sliver of hope I'd offered. As I walked away, the weight of her words followed me, a reminder of the fragile line between love and betrayal, and the long road ahead. The weeks that followed were tense, a fragile dance of cautious words and unspoken truths. Beth tried, in her way, to bridge the growing chasm between us. She cooked my favorite meals, left small notes on my nightstand, and offered smiles that didn't quite reach her eyes. But the damage was too fresh, the wound still raw. I kept my distance, pouring myself into work and spending as much time with the kids as possible. They were my anchor, their laughter and innocence a balm for the storm raging inside me. But even they could sense something was amiss. Natalie, my eldest, asked me one evening, "Dad, why doesn't Mom smile as much anymore?" I didn't have an answer. One Friday night, after putting the kids to bed, Beth approached me in the living room. She was nervous, wringing her hands as she sat across from me. "Mark," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to talk." I looked at her, waiting. "I've been seeing a therapist," she said. "I needed to understand why I did what I did. Why I risked everything we had. And," she took a deep breath. "I think it's time for us to go together." I raised an eyebrow. "Therapy?" "Yes," she said, her gaze steady. "If we have any chance of moving forward, we need to face this together. I know I broke your trust, and I don't expect forgiveness overnight. But I love you, Mark. I want to fight for us." Her words hung in the air, and for the first time in weeks, I saw a glimmer of the woman I'd fallen in love with, the determination, the vulnerability. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that we could find our way back to each other. But part of me still clung to the anger, the betrayal. "I'll think about it," I said finally, my tone guarded. She nodded, her expression a mix of hope and resignation. "That's all I ask." A few days later, I found myself sitting in a small, cozy office, across from a therapist who introduced herself as Dr. Harper. Beth sat beside me, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I had agreed to come, though I wasn't entirely sure why. Maybe it was for the kids, or maybe it was the faint hope that some part of us was worth salvaging. The sessions were grueling. We unpacked years of buried emotions, unspoken resentments, and unmet needs. Beth admitted to feeling lost in her role as a mother and wife, yearning for a sense of individuality she felt she had lost. I admitted to taking her for granted, to letting the daily grind of life overshadow the love that had once defined us. It wasn't easy. There were tears, accusations, and moments when I wanted to walk away. But there were also moments of clarity, of understanding. Slowly, I began to see Beth not as the woman who had betrayed me, but as a flawed, human partner who had made a terrible mistake. One evening, after a particularly emotional session, Beth turned to me in the car. "Mark," she said, her voice breaking. "I know I don't deserve it, but, do you think you could ever love me again?" I stared out the window, her question hanging in the air. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I want to try." Months passed, and things began to shift. Trust didn't return overnight, it came in small, fragile increments. A shared laugh over breakfast. A hand brushing mine as we passed each other in the hallway. Slowly, the pieces of our broken marriage began to form something new. Not the same, but something stronger in its honesty. Dan was a shadow of the past, an unwelcome ghost that no longer held power over us. Beth cut all ties with him, and I found solace in knowing she was making amends, not just with me, but with herself. The road ahead wasn't easy, but we walked it together. For the kids. For us. For the chance to rediscover what we had lost. And as I lay in bed one night, Beth curled beside me, her breath soft and even, I realized that love wasn't about perfection. It was about choosing each other, every day, even when it felt impossible. Even when it hurt. The end. Thank you for watching to the end. Write in the comments what you liked and what you would like to see next.